When I was a girl growing up in post-war Toronto, the only books I wanted to read were those featuring animals. Bambi, Black Beauty, Lassie, Babar, Curious George. I had barely transitioned to solid food before I knew on a cellular level that the world of human beings was a perilous one, and I had best find some other place to live, if only in my imagination. I needed to believe in goodness, so I parked my faith in animals. But only animals on the page, mind you, not actual animals I might come to know and love. We had a smattering of family pets over the years, but I can barely recall anything about them, not even their names. Our house was as dangerous for pets as it was for women and children. My father was the kind of man who would throw a sack of unplanned kittens into the lake. One of his favorite things was to hold the family cat against her will and then bite down on her ear until she cried out in pain. I witnessed this cruel ritual. You never know where you're going to cry, do you? Countless times, powerless to intervene in any way. Studies have shown that childhood exposure to animal abuse in the home cancels out any potential health benefits of having pets. For me, the only safe animals were the animals in books, where I could open and close their lives and jump over any dark pieces with the flip of a page. As I grew into adolescence, I traded in my animal stories for textbooks and began the steady march away from my family out into the world. By the time I was 25, I'd collected 3 jobs, 6 addresses, 5 girlfriends, 2/3 of a general arts degree, and a handful of dogs, all of whom met untimely ends. That's the dogs, not the girlfriends. The last dog in that posse was a brindle boxer named Phoebe. In a blazing act of unconsciousness, my girlfriend and I ordered her ears docked. It wasn't until I saw her post-operative bandages that I realized I had done the same thing to her that my parents had done to me. Setback autoplasty, the surgical correction of protuberant ears, was very stylish in the 1950s and was carried out ostensibly to help children who were being teased or taunted. Except in my case, I had never heard mention of my so-called problem ears. I had neither been teased nor taunted, and when my parents took my 7-year-old self straight to the operating table from a midsummer swimming lesson, I had no preparation or consultation. I was as bewildered as my beloved boxer must have been. But by 25, I'd pretty much perfected the art of dissociation. And the trouble with dissociation is that the body becomes an abandoned building. If there's nobody home, there is less empathy. Because at 25, I had lost the connection to my own childhood suffering, I could not advocate for my dog, and in fact subjected her to completely unnecessary surgery for the sake of a breed-driven cosmetic outcome. When my girlfriend and I broke up, she took Phoebe, and with that, I sealed shut the portal that only animals had ever passed through. 8 years later, at 33, my plan of invulnerability jettisoned, and I was brought down from behind like a gazelle in a National Geographic documentary. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, a ravaging autoimmune intestinal riot where the body attacks its own tissue. It is self-loathing made manifest. I went into therapy to try and save myself, and I started to make art also to try and save myself. At 42, after 17 years of resolute petlessness, I met a woman who entertained a cockatiel. Now, anyone who has ever lived with a bird knows they are one-person operations, meaning that if you are not their person, you are pretty much chopped tofu. This bird allowed her mistress to massage her pencil-thin neck, pull on her feathers, and kiss the top of her head. The bird would even offer to preen her mistress's teeth. None of these accommodations were ever extended to me, and any attempt on my part to join in the festivities was met with a committed bite. Still, Still, this creature weighed no more than a banana. If you think about it. This creature, who would not give me the time of day even if she'd owned a large watch, impressed upon my soul the imprint of her unique spirit and her will, indeed her right, to live. By the end of her earthly tenure, I had fashioned a series of landing strips and feeding stations all over the house, so she'd always have somewhere safe to put down. Her cage door was never shut and her wings were never clipped. Because of her, I started to see all birds as unique and special, not just the one in my house. In 2004, I created a body of artwork that connected the dots between avian and human life. As part of my research, I found myself seeking information about chickens. They are birds, after all, and there are more of them than any other bird in the world. Sadly, more chickens are raised and killed for food than all other land animals combined. Yeah, I think so too, sweetie. I think that's the truth down there. Yes, it would seem that our speciesism narrows to its most horrific point when it comes to this one bird. Studies over the past 20 years reveal that chickens possess a finely honed sensory repertoire, the ability to think, to dream in full color, to apply logic, plan ahead, and draw inferences. I'm a visual artist. I couldn't draw an inference to save myself. Hens have been known to exhibit mathematical reasoning, self-control, and even structural engineering, which means that when that chicken crossed the road, she was most likely checking to see that the geometric alignment of the highway took into consideration the environmental and social effects on the surrounding infrastructure.
I wish we would do the same.
And if this isn't impressive enough, get this. If a hen doesn't fancy a particular rooster's progeny, she can actually eject his sperm. Sister. Talk about post-copulatory sexual selection. Or not. I made a promise to our cockatiel that I would do what I could for her avian sisters and brothers. The pet, non-pet cloak was beginning to fray. I switched to free-range, organically fed chickens, not realizing that routine horrors are still allowed under the reassuring banner of the happy hen. Food habits die hard, perhaps because habit is too light a word. I think addiction is more to the point. When you think about it, no other activity, with the possible exception of sex, brings with it the unconscious freight that eating does. And if we are privileged enough to live outside the clutches of poverty, we get to do it multiple times every day. We get to eat on demand, and demand we do. The trouble with this whole scenario is that many of us are trying to fill way more than our stomachs. Many of us have hungers that run far too deep to ever be satisfied at the dinner table. Our food partialities are hardwired into us before we can operate cutlery. There are ghosts in the pantry, and they don't want us to wake up, and neither does the meat industry. So I hit the snooze button and went back to sleep, throwing comfort food like a blanket over a smoldering fire of dissonance. By Christmas 2001, there were 2 new additions to my home: an accordion and an 8-week-old Maltese poodle named Rosie. This was the dog on whom I would break my fast of imperviousness. She was the creature who would invite me to re-inhabit my body. Now this all sounds very movie of the week, does it not? But human beings don't generally volunteer to feel more vulnerable. And even fewer among us, especially women, are keen to reunite with bodies long ago deserted and from which we remain uncomfortably estranged. It had been 25 years since I last loved a dog, and I had spent most of that time trying very hard to outrun the fierce attachment that they had aroused. Now here I was, driving home with a four-legged, unexploded love ordnance in my lap, set to go off at the slightest quickening of my heart. Well, I would have needed a pacemaker dialed at 0 to not detonate that long. Rosie seemed to know that her work on this earth would involve my rehabilitation, and she started in almost immediately. There was nothing she had to do, really. It was more her being who she was. Spontaneous, unguarded, exuberant, and most of all, unconditionally loving. If I went to the room, or left the room to go to the toilet, I would be greeted upon my return like a post-Troy Ulysses. She grew to be 8 pounds in all, less than most people's cats, as feline fanciers were very quick to report. But she loomed magnificent in my emotional psychic world. She was a massive sun, a near total eclipse of the darkness I had lived with. Under Rosie's spell, I started to paint dogs, and although I never fashioned her likeness exactly, much to her chagrin, hundreds of canine specimens came to life in my studio and ran off to homes all over the world. I thought a handful of titles might give you a taste of what these paintings were about. My Dog Loves Me. Small Dog Accepts Award. Dances with Dogs. Rex Appeal. I know, I'm sorry. It's going to get worse for you. It's darkest before the dawn. Joan of Bark. Heartbeat at my feet. And for the more psychoanalytically inclined, attachment figure and love object. One title in particular pretty much says it all. First Responder. Rosie arrived on scene, the emotive emergency that was my life, and changed everything. As I said before, it's not what she did. Her ministry was one of example, and a large portion of her teaching was the way she lived in her body. She also lived in the present. These two things are immediate family, you know, like peanut butter and jam, because apparently the only way to be present is to be in your body. There's a famous experiment for a number of years ago where babies were placed at the edge of an apparent abyss and were either encouraged or discouraged to come across by the expression on the mother's face. She wasn't to speak, but convey using her face alone, either enthusiasm or consternation. Now, I said apparent abyss because there was a sheet of plexiglass spanning the Great Divide, but of course the baby couldn't know that. And if the mother was warm and encouraging, out the baby would crawl, even though there appeared to be no ground under her. Such is the power of secure, uncontaminated love. And this is what Rosie offered me, as she sat and stayed, cheering me on from the other side of the moat I had fashioned to keep all vulnerability at bay. Under her gentle and patient tutelage, I slowly emerged further into life, all the while becoming more embodied. And a funny thing happened on my way to greater corporeality. I stopped eating animals. It wasn't a mental decision, but a visceral conviction formed on the molecular level. There is much evidence of the robust link between embodiment and empathy. In fact, empathy has been referred to as emotional embodiment. The theory goes that if we are in our own bodies, if we experience life as the animals that we are, we cannot help but feel more connected to all animals, whether they walk or swim or fly. I have to admit, I didn't know for sure whether human beings were actually considered animals, and so I looked it up for this talk. And wouldn't you know, it's true. The meat industry, you know, I'm not surprised I doubted the fact, because the meat industry wants us to feel separated from and in fact superior to animals. After all, to call someone an animal, that's an insult. If a dinner guest was said to have eaten like an animal, it would conjure up images of abandoned cutlery and overturned soup tureens. and names being furiously crossed off invitation lists. It's an open and shut case of divide and conquer. If we believe ourselves to be separate from all other animals, we become licensed to behave badly towards them. What we see as other is typically excluded from our circle of moral concern. But this circle of concern can turn into a noose, choking out our innate capacity for attunement to all living beings. We can't actually cherry pick when it comes to empathy. We can't be truly empathic toward a select few species while brutalizing others. It's a bit like the smoking and non-smoking sections on planes. Remember that? Yeah. When airlines try to command cigarette smoke to stay in one portion of the cabin, separated by an invisible veil. Oh, the invisible veil that served to keep me safe yet alienated was brought down first by that pesky little cockatiel and then by my beloved Rosie. Dogs have a long and storied history of seasoned acumen, otherwise known as cutting through bullshit. You may remember it from The Wizard of Oz. It was Dorothy's Cairn Terrier Toto who pulled aside the heavy curtains to reveal the bogus Magi. Oh, I knew I was going to blow that. It is Magi, right? Good. God is reported to have said upon creating dogs, "Oh, these turned out great. I'm going to want all of them back at some point." Oh. Rosie died 7 weeks ago. Yeah, having completed her work here. It is with the deepest gratitude possible that I dedicate this talk, my creative work, and indeed, my remaining life to her memory. Thank you.